Hi, this is Kevin of the Virtual Planetarium at Raritan Valley Community College. Welcome to our weekly Star Talk. Today we're going to be talking about winter asterisms. But before we do that, we're going to talk about our upcoming moon phases. We have a new moon on March 2nd, we have a first quarter moon on March 10th, and then we have a full moon on March 18th. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about winter asterisms. But first, what is an asterism? An asterism is basically a made-up picture in the sky using stars. Now you might be wondering, isn't that exactly what a constellation is? And you would be correct. But there is a very big difference between asterisms and constellations, and that is that constellations are considered official. There are a set number of 88 official constellations in the whole sky. And this set number exists because a bunch of astronomers decided in 1928 to fully divide the night sky for all astronomers. And that way, every time somebody looked at a certain group of stars, everybody referred to it by the same name. So if we were to look at the whole night sky and put up all the constellations, we would see that they all divide the sky up by their boundaries. That's where we have these lines here that divide where a constellation starts and a constellation ends. And the whole sky is divided like this. There's not a single part of the sky that doesn't belong to a constellation. I can even get rid of the ground. You know what? Let's get rid of the atmosphere too. And we can see that the whole sky, even the South Pole that we can't see from here, is divided into these different constellation areas. The purpose of this was to make it easier to reference what part of the sky you were looking at. For example, if you as an astronomer found a comet in the constellation of Orion, you can just tell people, hey, I found this really cool thing in this constellation, and people would know what part of the sky to look for it. Now, of course, there are more specific coordinates that people can use to, see things in the sky, like we have right ascension and declination, but sometimes it's just easier to have, more general areas. So just like here on Earth, we have latitude and longitude, we also have all the land divided by countries. So we can think of the constellations as countries, and then we can use that for certain specific general mapping, whereas we can use the latitude and longitude coordinates for more specific things. So that's basically why we have the constellations, just map out the sky a little bit easier. Now, probably the biggest difference between asterisms and constellations is that, well, honestly, asterisms are easy to find, unlike a lot of constellations where you've seen me before trying to show you the dim stars that make up the small constellations that you probably won't be able to see here in New Jersey. Asterisms, on the other hand, are made out of the brightest stars, and they make very simple shapes. So they're a lot easier to find in the sky, and they're a lot easier to identify, and you don't really have to use your imagination that much, because a lot of them are just triangles and different basic shapes. But again, they use the brightest stars of different constellations that together make shapes that are very easy to recognize, and that way you can locate yourself a little bit easier in the sky. Now, the first asterism we're going to talk about today is actually a group of stars that we've mentioned many, many times here. You're probably sick of them, but they are the most famous group of stars in the winter sky and the easiest group of stars to find. And that is Orion's belt right here. So let's put up the constellation of Orion. Now, this whole thing is the constellation right here, but Orion's belt right here is a lot easier to find. It's a lot more recognizable, and a lot of people just refer to it as Orion's belt, and that in itself is just an asterism. While most of the constellation of Orion is bright enough and easy to see, like the shoulders up here, you might be able to call this an hourglass, and that could be an asterism as well. Orion's belt right here is probably one of the most famous asterisms just because of how simple it is and how much it stands out compared to everything else around it. Now, next to Orion's belt and Orion, we have another very simple wintertime asterism known as the Winter Triangle. I'm going to put up the asterisms here. Unfortunately, I can't put up one at a time, so it might get a little messy, but we're going to focus on what's called the Winter Triangle. And now to make the Winter Triangle, we are going to be using this bright star right down here, the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius. We're going to be using Orion's shoulder up over here, this reddish star called Betelgeuse. And then we're going to be using this other bright star over here called Procyon, which belongs to a third different constellation that's really hard to see. It belongs to Canis Minor, the small dog, which is really just 2 stars, but it's hard to make that out as a constellation. So instead of finding these 3 separate constellations, we can piece together these 3 stars and make what is known as the Winter Triangle. And that's another very easy to find asterisms because, again, they're made up of 3 very, very bright stars that belong to separate constellations. Now, an even bigger asterism that I don't like showing it to people in the real sky because it's so big, it's a little confusing. It's called the Winter Hexagon. And we make this, again, using the brightest stars that we see around the constellation of Orion. We start with Sirius right down here. Just as a reminder, an easy way to identify Sirius is, first of all, it's the brightest star in the sky. But second of all, you can use Orion's belt right here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit to that. And if you draw a line downwards from Orion's belt, we come to the bright star, and that's how you can confirm that it's Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. Now, if we use Sirius and then we connect that to Rigel, one of Orion's knees, and actually Orion's brightest star, and then we go up to Aldebaran, the eye of the bull, and then we go all the way up to Capella, and we can see that using all these stars, Pollux over here and then Procyon, which we just found, we can make a giant hexagon in the sky. And again, not an official constellation, but it might be easier to put together a hexagon instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different constellations. Now, probably the most famous asterism of all is towards the northern part of the sky. Let me get rid of these so I don't give it away which one I'm talking about. We're going to turn the sky around so we are facing north. We were previously just facing south. And we're going to be looking towards the northeast. And when we do that, we come to this very famous group of 7 stars right over here. And this is a group of stars that a lot of people will call it their favorite constellation, or the only constellation they can find, or something constellation. And that is the Big Dipper. But the Big Dipper is actually not a constellation. The Big Dipper by itself is an asterism. Probably the most famous asterism because it's really easy to find, but again, not an official constellation. Instead, it belongs to the official constellation of the Big Bear, or Ursa Major. And we can tell that the Big Dipper is just the butt and the tail of this big bear in the sky. But again, the reason the Big Dipper is so much more famous than the whole Big Bear is that all these other stars that make up the rest of the constellation are fairly dim. And especially nowadays with so much light pollution that we have, it's really easy to just spot the brightest stars, and those would be the ones in the Big Dipper right here. Now, these are just 4 asterisms that I've shown you: Orion's Belt, the Winter Triangle, the Winter Hexagon, and the Big Dipper. But there are many, many other asterisms in the sky. Again, they're just unofficial pictures that you can make up in your mind. So you can make up whatever asterism you would like. And if you want to call it a slice of pizza, you can do that. For example, what we do with the Summer Triangle. There's other asterisms that are easy to find that we'll talk about later. We won't give them all away now. We'll talk about them as they come up higher in the sky. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you learned something new. You should at least try to go find these asterisms. Again, they're a lot easier to find than all the individual constellations, and that's why we like them so much. If you liked this video, be sure to give us a like, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel. Thanks again for joining, and hope you have a great week.